is something which is not at all verified by sense and reason. So if there was something as polytheism, if there were more than one gods, the Almighty says that only I could have divulged this secret. Only I could have told humankind that there are more than one God than me. Then only this, of course, could have been verified. When the Almighty has not given us this information, the Almighty says that whoever makes up this information, he is guilty of fabrication. He is guilty of fabricating a huge lie or imputing a huge lie on God, simply because this is not possible unless and until the Almighty discloses this fact. So we need to understand this, that as far as polytheism is concerned, the reason that the Almighty is extremely angry about it is that people make this up from their own selves. They do not go into any detail. They do not support their view with any argument. So the basic thing which the Almighty has emphasized, in fact overemphasized a number of times in the Quran, is that polytheism is something which people have fabricated. And I would like to point out here one important thing which often we tend to forget, and that is there is a difference between polytheism of the people of Arabia vis-a-vis the idolatries of Arabia, and of course the people of the book. So there is one very important distinction that has to be made. Not at a single place in the Quran have the people of the book been called mushrikun or idolaters or polytheists, because they never subscribed to polytheism, in spite of the fact that they were guilty of very heinous forms of polytheism. Like, for example, we know that the Christians regarded Jesus to be the Son of God. And similarly, we know that the Jews of Arabia, they regarded Uzair or Ezra to be the Son of God. And let me make this clarification here, that this was specifically the view of the Jews of Arabia, not mainstream Jews or other Jews. And in spite of this, they were never called as mushrikun or idolaters by the Quran, simply because they themselves subscribe to monotheism. They themselves subscribe to Tawheed. And whenever someone would say that Trinity or the way you believe in God is something which goes against monotheism, they would argue with him and not accept this argument that they are indulging in any sort of polytheism or any sort of idolatry. On the other hand, the mushrikun of Arabia, the polytheists of Arabia, they would admit that they are indulging in polytheism. They would say that they are more than one gods and that they are worshipping other lesser gods in order to reach the one greater God. So this is the reason that in the whole corpus of the Quran, we only find the mushrikun or the idolaters of Arabia being addressed as mushrikun. As I said, the people of the book, in spite of committing some blatant forms of polytheism, were never called as idolaters or polytheists, because they themselves actually interpreted the way they believed in God, that Trinity in itself is a form of monotheism. Although, of course, this could be differed with, and we do differ with this, but the fact is that the Quran accepted their claim, and the Quran accepted that they are actually indulging in some sort of polytheism, in spite of the fact that they subscribe and they emphasize that they are followers of monotheism. So therefore, it did not regard them to be the mushrikun. This is a very important distinction that we have to make, and we must make as well. The other thing that we must know is that shirk or polytheism or idolatry is something which becomes a real sin is when it is committed intentionally. Of course, there are very few chances that people might not do it intentionally, but there are very heavy chances that this can be indulged in unintentionally, without knowing that they are doing something which is evil or they are doing something which is bad. So therefore, we need to understand that as far as polytheism is concerned, as far as idolatry is concerned, it is a big and heinous crime if it is indulged intentionally. And the other thing is that the reason for this gravity of this crime is that people indulge in it without realizing that they have not been given this information, because only God could have told us that he has partners. And since he never disclosed us that he has partners, so what we are doing is we are imputing partners from our own behalf, on our own behalf. And this, of course, is something which God does not forgive. And he says that this is like imputing partners to God without any basis. And the third thing that we have discussed is that we must make a distinction between people who indulge in idolatry and people who are idolaters, or people who indulge in polytheism and people who are actually polytheists. Even Muslims at times, when they go to graves and mausoleums and they prostrate before the graves of saints and pray to them, they are indulging in a form of polytheism. But in spite of this, they still are regarded as Muslims and they're regarded as monotheists, although they could be regarded as deviants among monotheists. But just as we do not regard a Muslim who has indulged in a form of polytheism by prostrating before the grave of a saint, in a similar manner, we never regard the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, to be people who are mushrik or people who are polytheists, simply because they themselves do not ascribe to this. And what best we can say is that, like this particular Muslim, which I just gave an example of, these people of the book are also deviant monotheists. But the fact is that they are monotheists. And the biggest proof of this is that not at one place in the Quran have they been called as mushrikun. So this is a very, very important thing that we must realize, that there is not a single place in which the people of the book are called mushriks or polytheists, as I said, because they themselves lay claim to monotheism in spite of the fact that they do indulge in certain heinous forms of polytheism. So this is an important distinction that we must make. This is a very important point that we must take note of. And also we must realize that as far as the idolatry is concerned, as far as polytheism is concerned, today it does exist. Although in Arabia it was cleansed in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know that in his own times polytheism was totally wiped out. The mushrikun had either accepted faith or given up their faith, and Arabia became a center of Tawheed, a center of monotheism ever since the time of the Prophet, and it is persisting. And this peculiar state of Arabia is still there, that it is the center of Tawheed, the center of monotheism, vouchsafed by the Almighty Himself. So viewers, now we go on to the next part of our discussion, which actually is a very important topic that although we may have covered earlier on, but we need to understand that this is a grave area in which we Muslims generally are victims of misconceptions and misperceptions. So this is actually the dua of Istikhara, which has been cited in the Al-Jami' al-Sahih of Imam Bukhari, and it has been reported on the authority of a famous companion who is Jabir bin Abdullah. So let me first read out the text of this narrative before you, which is actually a supplication from the Prophet, and then we'll go through its translation and also a brief explanation of the contents. So the words are: Allahumma inni astakhiruka bi'ilmika wa astaqdiruka biqudratika wa as'aluka min fadlika al-azim فإنك لا تقدر ولا أقدر وتعلم ولا أعلم وأنت علام الغيوب اللهم إن كنت تعلم أن هذا الأمر خير لي في ديني ومعاشي وعاقبة أمري فاقدره لي ويسره لي ثم بارك لي فيه وإن كنت تعلم أن هذا الأمر شر لي في ديني ومعاشي وعاقبة أمري فاصرفه عني واصرفني عنه واقدر لي الخير حيث كان ثم ردني به. Translation of this is: O God, I seek goodness through your knowledge and through your might, and I seek through your might I seek strength, and I request from you your great blessings, because you have the might and I do not have the might. You know everything and I do not know, and you have knowledge of the unseen. God, if in your knowledge this action which I intend to do is better with regard to my religion, my life, and my fate, then destine it for me and make it easy for me, and then add blessings to it for me. God, in your knowledge, if this action is evil for me, for my religion and for my fate, then turn it away from me, and God, whatever is better for me, ordain that for me, wherever it is, and then make me satisfied with it. So clearly you can see that this is a beautiful supplication of the Prophet which has been taught to us, and unfortunately the way we use this supplication is as if there is a hotline between every person who reads this supplication and the Almighty, and as soon as he reads these words after praying 2 rakats of namaz, he would get probably some indication in a dream, and then he goes or she goes on to do something, whatever is seen in that dream. So this is a very common misconception, and I think I've discussed this earlier on as well in some of our previous sessions. But just to recap, that this prayer, Istikhara, is a prayer, just like any other supplication, just like any other prayer. It is a prayer when a person is at crossroads, when we have expended all our knowledge, all our experience, all our intellect on maybe trying to find out which is the better way for us. If we have 2 or 3 equal opportunities, we are stuck at times, and we have exhausted everything, every single intellectual point that we have regarding deciding between 2 or 3 options, and we get stuck. We are not able to decide which of these 3 or 4 ways we should adopt. It is at this point that the dua or the supplication of Istikhara has been taught to us, that we pray to God, we supplicate before Him, we ask Him that Almighty, that it is something that I have done my best. I have tried to ascertain what I would like to do, but I am still not very certain what to do. So please help me in finding out at which of these 3 or 4 options should I adopt. And if I do something, then please make it very beneficial for me. Turn my heart towards it if it is beneficial for me. And if this choice is not beneficial for me, then, oh God, please turn me away from this option, and also make me content and satisfied with this option. So as you can see, it's a beautiful prayer, and any person on earth can make this supplication to the Almighty to guide him or her if he or she is stuck on a crossroad. But it does not mean that as soon as you read the prayer of Istikhara, then perhaps the Almighty will guide you in a dream or in some other way. He may, of course, guide you in any way, but it is not a guaranteed thing. Just as a supplication can be accepted, it could be turned down, it could be deferred. So in a very similar way, the prayer of Istikhara also has a very similar fate, that it could, if we pray to God, He might answer our prayer, He might defer our prayer, or He might choose to remain silent. But the bottom line is that in all these 3 or 4 or 2 or 3 options, He is our greatest well-wisher. He intends good for us, and so whatever option He chooses for us is best suitable for us. But at the same time, we must understand that as far as the prayer of Istikhara is concerned, it is not meant to be something which always gets answered, as is the general perception. It does not always get answered. So at times you get this indication, at times you get this brainwave, at times you get a hunch, at times you feel that someone is guiding you. But again, whatever is being guided to you, whatever you are being told, must not negate common sense. It must not negate intellect. It must not intellect established norms of reason and sense. Because you see, whatever indication you get in any form, whether you get it or not, if you get it, then it has to be something which actually must not defy your own common sense and your own knowledge which the Almighty has blessed you. So, and the other thing is that we must also realize that the prayer of Istikhara, as I said, is just like any other prayer. It's just like any other supplication. And we need to also do our homework when we pray or when we offer this supplication. And that is that we have to give in our own bit as well. And that is that we have to actually expend all our experience, all our strategical outlook as far as deciding a matter is concerned. So if we have to, for example, decide between a couple of job opportunities that come our way, then it's not that we are going to rely on some weird or ambiguous indication defying norms of sense and reason and not using our common sense. So whatever our common sense tells us, or whatever way forward we go, it has to be reinforced by that indication in whatever form we get. We just cannot rely on that indication and sacrifice common sense and knowledge. That indication, of course, is something which should reinforce our own thought process. So, my dear viewers, this is a very, very grave and a critical area. We Muslims often indulge in this is the prayer of istikhara without realizing that istikhara is something which is merely a request before the Almighty. If the Almighty chooses, He might accede to this request, He might defer the request, and He might totally ignore our request. So, we need to understand this, and of course, the person who should be doing istikhara is the person who is the affectee. So, if I am the person who is, for example, looking for a couple of jobs, and I do have a few people, a few options before me, then of course it's me who is affected the most, and I should be doing this prayer or doing this istikhara instead of asking other people to do so, because I am the person who needs this istikhara. And also, we need to understand that this is something which has to be done. In general, supplications have to be made once we have done our part. You see, supplication is requesting God to do His part. And the Almighty always is insistent on this, that we have to do our part. And our part is that we have to exhaust our energies and our effort towards understanding what the right path might be. And after that, the Almighty adds His blessings if He wants to, or He may not wish to. But then it will only happen if we have done our part. It's much like saying that if we start praying and supplicating to the Almighty that please make me pass with flying colors in my exam, and the fact is that I haven't even read my textbook and I have not even worked hard in preparing for the exam. And what good a prayer would do in that case when I have not done the needful that I was required to do. So in a similar way, the du'as, that whatever we make, whether it's the dua of istikhara or whether any other dua or whether any other supplication, we have to do our part. We have to do our part, and that is that whatever prayer that we are asking for, or whatever supplication that we are asking God for us to do, we have to do our own homework and our own background information and efforts that we need to put into it. So this is a very commonly misunderstood area regarding Islam and our connection with the Almighty. We must not think that istikhara is something which is a hotline between a person and the Almighty. We don't, whatever indication we get is only something of a reinforcement. It's not something that we should think of as if we are given an indication by the Almighty directly, because that would be tantamount to receiving divine revelation or wahi from the Almighty, and we know that the door of divine revelation has closed with the passing away of the last prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and hence no such communication which can make us certain that we are receiving some indication from God is happening here, and hence we have to be very, very careful here. So viewers, let us now go on to the third part of our study session, and this is the Bible verse of the day. And the verse that I've chosen is verse 9 from chapter number 27 of the book of Proverbs, which of course is the book of Solomon, very revered prophet of God. And the title that I've given this verse is True Friendship. So the words are, perfume and incense bring joy to the heart, and the pleasantness of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. So in a very brief way, the King Solomon, the Prophet Solomon, has summed up the essence of friendship, and he says that the pleasantness of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. In other words, the point that he is making is that a friend is a well-wisher of his friend. He is always someone who is looking after the interest of his friend. He is always someone whom a friend can fall back. He is someone whose advice, even if it at times may be harsh, it might be stern, but it is given in the best interest of the person. It is given in the best interest of the person or his friend. And as far as things are concerned, you can see clearly how the comparison is made here, that perfumes might bring joy to the heart, but pleasantness of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. That if you know what a pleasant friend is, if you know what true friendship is, then you need to understand that true friendship springs from this heartfelt advice, which means that you're always thinking good of your friend. You're always thinking that if he is in a spot of bother, or if he is doing something wrong, maybe inadvertently, maybe he or she is overlooking something without realizing that. So as a true friend, it is our responsibility. As a true friend, it is we who need to take the initiative, take the lead in breaking the ice and presenting whatever good advice we think that we need to present. Viewers, we need to understand that this also is a very, very technical thing. It's a skill that we need to acquire. When we give some advice to a person, of course, this is the time that you are at times criticizing your friend, because you think that the advice that you're giving is going to stop him from something wrong that he might be doing. It is at this stage that we have to be very careful, because when you criticize someone, or when you in your own good faith, of course you are advising your friend in your own good faith, you would not like him to fall down in a pit or maybe end up in some problem. So you at times your advice is in the form of a critique. So it is here that we need to understand that criticism has certain etiquette, and the foremost etiquette of a criticism is that it has to be couched in very, very polite words. So you see, what we at times do without realizing, because we think that we are advising our friends, our choice of words is not appropriate. We use harsh words, we use harsh sentences, and we swear and we get worked up. This is something that we need to understand, that as far as advising someone is concerned, if it is in the form of a critique, then it has to be couched in simple and very, very concerned, in a very concerned tone. And then we also need to realize this, that giving advice also needs an opportune time. It's not that at every time that we have this inkling of this urge of advising others, we should just go up to him and start advising him or her. No, that's not the right way. The right way is that we need to realize that we have to understand that the other person has a certain perspective. He or she might not be in the mode or in the mood of listening to you. So we have to wait for the right time. Giving an advice is something, and giving advice at the right time is the appropriate thing. And if we realize that our advice might be understood in a different way, or might be perceived as a different thing, that we might even choose to abstain from that. Because you see, advising someone is always beneficial when our advice is given at the right time. And then, dear viewers, another very important thing is that at times we do talk about this advice regarding our friends, but then we don't realize that we are talking to them directly. At times we advise a friend, instead of directly advising him, we give this advice to someone else, and then that advice in the form of critique reaches that person, and which might hurt him or her. So if we have something to say to someone, let it be direct, let it be couched in simple words and in very, very polite words, let it be at the right time. And then, dear viewers, it must not be repetitive. We need to realize that repetitive criticism or repetitive advice always becomes counterproductive. Advice has to be given at the right time. It has to be given sparingly. It has to be given, especially to adults, in a very, very careful way. If we start doing it every now and then, it will lose its importance. It will lose its effect. So, as I said, that friendship is a very, very precarious thing at times, that you lose friends by a loose talk. Loose talk, loose words, they at times go and make that person very, very hurtful of our words. We need to realize that the wounds inflicted by the tongue, as the saying goes, are much more deep than the wounds inflicted by the sword. So sweet words, if our critique is in the form of sweet words, I can assure you that it will, of course, have its impact. But if our critique is couched in harsh words, then the most substantive of critiques might end up as a total failure, because we have not given enough thinking to the structure and the format in which we should present our advice. And we also need to realize, this is a technique, this is a tactic that has often worked, that whenever we criticize someone in the form of an advice, let it begin by acknowledging the positive points of that person. You see, when you are criticizing someone, you need to make him realize or make her realize that you are a well-wisher of that person. And that will only happen if you also start your critique and start your advice by acknowledging the positive points of that person. If you do that, you'll find that person is going to lend an ear to you in a much more emphatic way, in a much more stressed way. So therefore, these are some of the norms that we need to keep before us when we are offering our advice to our friends, when we are criticizing our friends, because you see, criticism is an extremely difficult art. It's a skill. We have to learn this skill. And wrong criticism or right criticism in wrong words often destroys, then rebuilds. It often breaks, and it does not bring two people closer together. So we have to learn this art, and not only must we learn this art, I think we need to teach this art as well to our younger generation, because criticism and advice is something which comes to us so naturally. It comes to us in such a natural way that without realizing we utter this, and without realizing we utter words which might cause a lot of hurt, and hence we need to understand that this is something that might be make or a break phenomena, and we have to be people who bring other people closer to each other than bring them farther away from each other. So, and this is a beautiful lesson that we have learned from the Prophet Solomon's Proverbs, and I would say that this is something that we must stick to and adhere to. We should become true friends of one another. And let me end this small topic by saying that the biggest friendship is, of course, being soulmates of one another, which means that you actually think of the other person the way he or she thinks of you, and the way you know that your compatibility is working is the way in which, in spite of the fact that you may be discussing views which might be divergent, views which you might not agree with, but at the same time, you do feel that you are being heard. You do feel that you're not being ignored. You do feel that you can fall back on someone. So you become soulmates of that person. And I think this is the quintessence of friendship. If we can become soulmates to one or two people, this is also a very, very relaxing phenomena, because it gives us the chance to express ourselves. It gives us the chance to relieve ourselves from a lot of stress. It gives us the chance to also find out how we can come closer to other people, how we can help other people, and we become true friends of one another. Remember, friendship is not about point scoring. Remember, friendship is not about competition. Friendship is a companionship. Friendship is something in which you actually you genuinely feel that your friend should or would outrun you. He or she would become a better person than your own self. You don't become selfish. You in fact become selfless. And selflessness, I think, as I said, just like become you're a good person when you become a soulmate of the other person. In a very similar way, if you are selfless, if you are a person who really thinks about your friend, then you have done your part and you have done your job, and hopefully the Almighty will actually have this effect on the other person, that he or she, whatever you would like to convey to him or her, would be properly conveyed in a very, very congenial way. So viewers, this brings us to an end to the first part of our session, in which we discuss the Quran, the Hadith, and the Bible. And if you have any questions regarding what we have just discussed, please go ahead, and inshallah, once we are finished with this, we will then go on to discuss a misconception. So I see one hand. This is Mr. Asir Zahur. Let me just unmute your mic. Yes, please go ahead, Asir. Very faintly. Could you speak a little louder?
Sir, I'm trying. Can you hear me now, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Well.
Assalamu alaikum. Sir, first I have a few questions. First one is in relation to the verse of the Quran that you quoted of Surah Nisa. Sir, in the translation, I see parenthesis which says, according to His law. Allah forgives all sins other than the polytheism according to His law. if what is the law? Has it been mentioned in the Quran?
Well, it has been, yes, it has been mentioned at several places in the Quran. For example, one of the statutes of this law is that he forgives minor sins. As far as major sins are concerned, they have to be made amends for. For example, if you have killed someone, then it's not just the Almighty who can forgive you, unless the person you have killed, he also forgives you. So there are certain things in which forgiveness is not just the prerogative of the Almighty, it's conditional to the forgiveness by the offended party as well. Similarly, it's not that all sins will be forgiven. Of course, there could be sins in which a person repeatedly indulges in something in spite of the fact that they may be minor sins. So there are a couple of things which are included in this, but the major thing is that at times this forgiveness is contingent or is conditional on the forgiveness of other people, because the offended party is not just the Almighty in some cases. In many cases, He is the only person who is aggrieved, because when we are not offering enough, then that is something that we are at fault. But when we are actually offending someone else, then the person who is offended, he or she must also forgive us, and total forgiveness will only take place once both the Almighty and that person forgives us at the same time.
You mentioned that polytheism has been completely wiped out in Arabia.
Yeah.
So then, why, when you say Arabia, does this mean the entire Arabian Peninsula or only the Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, of course, I refer to the Arabian Peninsula, but the stress is, of course, on the Baitullah, the areas of Makkah and Medina, the other two holy places, especially those. But of course, the purpose is to point out to the entire Arabian Peninsula, but in particular to these two holy places.
So this is, I'm asking this question is because of late there are, I don't know whether I should say this or not, sheikhs offering a land for construction of temples.
Mm-hmm.
So in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi.
So you see, that is something that has evoked a lot of debate. So although they have been offering this, but they have been ticked off by scholars, because they know that this is the status occupied by the Arabian Peninsula, that it has to be a center of monotheism, and if non-Muslims are going to live there, they can make temporary places of worship, for example, in their own houses, but making temples or making churches or making synagogues maybe has something which has been simply forbidden, because the Almighty says that He has chosen this area to be a center of monotheism as a model place. Of course, all the rest of the world in every part of the world, wherever Muslims live, even in majority in their countries, all such temples and synagogues and churches and other worship places can be built. But there is one place where the Almighty has chosen for His center of Tawheed. He did so before as well. He chose Palestine before. He chose the Arabian Peninsula. These were the two areas in which He actually settled two of His great prophets. One of them was the Prophet Ishmael, and the other one was the Prophet Isaac. Both are the progeny of Abraham. So basically, Abraham's progeny was given these two areas in custody so that they could make them the centers of monotheism in their own times, and this continued to exist. Unfortunately, Palestine or Jerusalem could not maintain its original shape because of a lot of reasons which can be discussed. But then later on, when this was shifted towards the Arabian Peninsula, then this status was given to it ever since the time of the Prophet. And that is the reason that we do not tolerate polytheism there. And as I said, we have to make this distinction as well, that there's one thing as polytheism and there's one thing as the polytheistic practice of the people of the book. So the people of the book, they are still monotheists, although they might indulge in forms of polytheism. And the Quran recognizes them as monotheists, which I just explained, and it has never called them polytheists. So we need to make this distinction as well.
Sir, last question is relating to the last lectures that I was trying to ask, but maybe there was some problem with the microphone. Sir, there was a question put to you about Surah Isra. about Miraj, and you said that the Quran itself answers that this was not actually a dream but a vision which was shown to the Holy Prophet. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sir, but the verse that you quote, in fact, every Quranic translation that I've read, they do not use the word roya. They do not translate it as a dream. They translate it as a vision.
Right.
So that leaves space for debate, because they say a vision could be physical.
So you see, we have dealt with this subject in detail. Maybe you can just pick a YouTube talk on this subject. I have tried to examine the views of scholars who say that the word vision is actually royat. So they say that the word وَمَا جَعَلْنَا رُؤْيَا الَّتِي أَرَيْنَاكَ إِلَّا فِتْنَةً لِلنَّاسِ, which is perhaps verse 74, I think, of Surah Bani Israel. They do acknowledge that it was but the only thing is that they say that the word roya is actually means royat. Royat means to see by the eye. So there is a difference between roya and royat. Roya means to see psychologically in your imagination, the way you see a dream. And the word royat, the way you say royat hilal, means to see with your plain eyes. So what they do is that they interpret the word roya in the meaning of royat, which of course is against the principles of Arabic. And this is because they have already made up their minds that it was not a spiritual journey, it was not a journey in the dream. They think that it's a physical journey which actually took place. Because they have made up their minds, once they have read the first verse of Surah Bani Israel, they have made up their mind that this verse is actually telling us that it was a physical journey. So they are now bound to actually make this interpretation so that they can reconcile both verses of the Quran. So this reconciliation in their minds can only take place if they interpret the word vision in the form of a dream. Whereas in my humble opinion, the word royat, which is something which had to be used there for it to connote the fact that it was something which he saw from his eyes. The fact is that this is something which he saw from his the mind's eye, as I would say. And what you see from your mind's eye is a vision, is a dream. And I would urge you, if you could look up that small, we have actually given a detailed talk on this subject in which we have analyzed these views, and also how grammatically the word royat, had it been present there, would have altered the meaning. But since it is not present, the word roya is decisive in Arabic to reflect, to mean that it is actually referring to a dream. And when we say a vision, that also is actually a dream in the form of a dream, not a vision which is seen by your eyes.
It could also be because of the various hadith relating to it,
right,
that consolidates their view.
Exactly. So the third thing that has played its part are certain narratives. But again, you see that if you see some of the narratives, you'll find out that some of the narratives are so explicit that it was a dream. For example, the narrative, on the basis of these narratives, we find Aisha radhiyallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet, and Amir Muawiyah, again someone who remained close to the Prophet, having this view that I'm sorry, no, he was not there, but Aisha radhiyallahu anha was the person who has actually said this, that it was a spiritual journey. It was not a physical journey.
Yes. Right. Thank you.
Okay. So we now go on to the next part of our discussion. If there are no more questions, which I assume there are none. Walaikum Assalam.
It's Raza from UK. I'd like to ask a relevant question to what you mentioned earlier regarding criticism. So are there any good examples from the Quran of how God himself criticized others while maintaining the things that you were talking about?
You see, when the Almighty does something, it has its own implications, because being the Lord of the worlds and God of the world, He knows what is in our hearts. You see, He has account of our own inner feelings and our inner thoughts. So therefore, His way of doing things cannot be something which can be followed at all times, simply for the fact that he has an all-embracing knowledge. Whereas we human beings, we need to understand that the person that we are criticizing is in a certain mood. We don't know what his internal intentions are. Maybe he's passing through a bad patch in life. On the other hand, this information is, of course, you would acknowledge, is known to the Almighty. So the way he deals with people with whom he is directly interacting with, for example, in his own times when the Quran was being revealed in the times of the Prophet, he made some very direct comments on the leadership of the Quraysh simply because he knew them inside out. So I think that instead of perhaps going after how God deals with this, although there can be examples in which which can be made made a model for us as well, if we think a little, but perhaps a little more closer critique in this regard would be how the Prophet behaved. And let me tell you that his behavior was something that is really worth following. Just to give you an example in order to make this point clear. In Surah Tahrim, there is this incident in which the two wives of the Prophet, they had actually annoyed the Prophet because the secret which was actually confided by the Prophet in one of the wives, she actually divulged that secret to another wife, and this became known to the Prophet, and he was sort of little annoyed at why has this happened. And it is here that the Quran has a very, very strong statement to make regarding the character of the Prophet. And he said that he was annoyed with his wives, and there were a couple of points that he wanted to make and to tell them that they had done something wrong, and there were more than 2 or 3 things that he wanted to point them out. The Quran says that arrafa ba'zahu wa a'raza an ba'z, and this is a very object lesson in criticism, and that is that when you feel that you need to criticize someone and the points are 3 or 4 or 5, you don't take up all the points. You just indicate one of them, maybe 2 of them, so that if a person who is of caliber and intellect, it's sufficient for him or her to realize that if one of the faults is being pointed out, he or she automatically realizes that there could be others as well. And this is a very beautiful technique on the part of the criticizer, that instead of taking notice of all the bad points, he just raises a couple of them, maybe just one of them. And this is sufficient for the other person to realize that there might be others as well, and he is or she is bound to think. And this is precisely what happened here in Surah Tahrim. If you just read the opening parts of this surah, you'll realize that the Prophet, as a very master psychologist, instead of bringing all the points and scolding, maybe criticizing his wives for all these points, he just, the Quran says, arrafa ba'zahu wa a'raza an ba'z. He raised a couple of them and the rest he ignored, because as you know that if you raise a couple of points, a person of intellect and sense realizes that there could be others as well. So these are the techniques which the Prophet adopted, and if you go outside the Quran, you'll find the Prophet dealing with his Sahaba, which is with his companions, as a master psychologist would do. He would give different answers of the same questions to different companions because of the fact that they had different capacities, different intellects, different statuses, and different positions. So to Abu Zar he would reply in another way, to Abu Huraira he would reply in another way, to Umar and Abu Bakr he would reply in another way. The question might be the same. So if we just see how the Prophet psychologically dealt with his companions, you'll find so many examples that you can actually learn from these examples, that we ourselves can conduct our lives in their light.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Okay. The question that, the misconception that we are going to discuss today has partly been discussed by me earlier on when I was referring to the fact that people of the book have not been called mushrik or idolaters or polytheists. So I'm going to make this point again, because this is something that we have missed a lot of times as Muslims, and especially when we become very, very energized and very emotional in these affairs, we do not make this distinction that what a person believes himself or herself is the real thing. He might be a person who is deviant, he might be a person who has gone astray, but as long as his own or her own belief is something, you have to acknowledge that person. So this would be like saying that you don't judge people by your standards. you judge people by their standards. If a person is true to his standard or to her standard, it means that he or she is a sincere person. You might be differing with him or her, but then as long as you are there and he is there or she is there, this difference of opinion is bound to exist. So the misconception or the area that I'd like to discuss briefly today is that we must stop judging people at all times. This is a common mistake that we make. Judging people is the sole prerogative of the Almighty. Because you see, judging people requires an information of your intentions. It requires information of your heart. And we are no one to know in what position a person is. So therefore, we must not judge people. If we have to judge someone, it has to be our own selves. And then, if we have to judge someone, then it has to be on the standards of that person. It cannot be on our own standards. Because you see, each person is someone who is answerable to the Almighty on the basis of what he or she thinks. He has to be sincere in what he or she thinks. But then, if he or she thinks something which is not our own opinion, we have to judge that person by what he thinks for him is right or wrong. I would like to give you a very interesting anecdote in this regard, which I once came across myself, and that is that I was traveling in an aircraft once, and when I had taken my seat, I suddenly saw some commotion in some of the front seats, and I saw a bearded person entering the plane, and he was actually coming forward, and he was going to take a seat which was just in front of my own seat, about a couple of rows ahead. And he was hesitant in entering his own seat, because his seat was juxtaposed, was in between the seat of the two other seats which were on the flanks were occupied by women. So one was a lady on the left, and the other one was a lady on the right. And that person was actually hesitant in going towards his seat, because he thought that he would not like to sit between two women. This is something which he thought that his standards don't allow him to do. And everyone started to make fun of him there. And he was actually booed, and people didn't like that he was actually creating this fuss. The air hostess there, the stewards there, they got together and said that you must go and sit there because this is a standard procedure, and you might change once the aircraft flies, but but as long as it is standing and taxiing, you have to sit on the seat that has been allocated for you. But he did not. He thought that his own religion has stopped him from doing something, and maybe I and you might have differed with him, and we might have gone and taken the seat, and of course sat in a very decent way, because there's always a method to doing things. But instead of I would say condemning that person, I was full of praise for that person. Not because I condoned what he did, because I thought that he was doing something of a wrong thing. But the praise that came to my mind was because he was actually conforming to his own standards. He was a person who did not want, who thought that his religion is stopping him from sitting between two women, and he tolerated the jeers and the mockery of the people around him, but he didn't give up. So we might have differed with him, but I think he was true to his own thought, true to his own belief. So this is something which I often discuss with my colleagues and my peers, that let's not, in spite of differing with others, let's not put our standards in their mouth. Let's not judge them by our standards. We have to judge them by their standards. Their sincerity has to be judged by their standards. We might differ with their view, but who cares? Because you see, this difference is something which is by default. All of us differ with one another because we have different points of view. So, viewers, this brings us to an end to this session of our study circle, and we have still a couple of minutes to go. So, if you have any questions, please go ahead. So I see Ms. Rafia Khwaja, madam. I'm going to unmute your mic. Please go ahead. A kindly unmute your mic. It's self-muted. You have to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Saleem, Dr. Shehzad, I have two questions.
Right.
I was reading the Quran and I was reading about the time when Prophet Ibrahim was thrown into the fire. And I wanted to read a little more detail. So I went and started looking at the Hadith. And I just wanted to mention to you, if you could advise me, one Hadith said that the animals and the birds were putting off the fire. The second Hadith said that the angels came and surrounded Prophet Ibrahim. The third Hadith said that Hazrat Jibreel put a ring on Prophet Ibrahim's finger and it became a garden. So I was very confused because to what extent do we believe which hadith is authentic? Because the Quran simply said the fire cooled down. So I wanted your advice that whether when one wants a little more clarification, I think I wrote to you also, this doesn't seem to be a good idea going and looking at these hadiths because you don't know which is authentic.
Right.
And I have another question after that, which if you allow me, I'll tell you now, that since none of us have seen the Prophet ﷺ, how can anybody say that they have seen the Prophet in their dream?
Right.
Nobody can claim that. Is that correct?
Right. So as far as your first question is concerned, we need to understand that, of course, there are a lot of narratives which speak of the fact that how the fire actually cooled down for Abraham, and these narratives need to be checked for their authenticity, and I cannot comment on them unless I can look up their chains of narration. But as far as the Quran is concerned, the Quran just says in a very concise and a very succinct way that the fire was ordered by the Almighty, Kuniya Naro Bardam wa Salamun ala Ibrahim, that it should cool down and become peace and comfortable for Abraham. That is how the Quran actually describes it. And narratives, we have to be careful in looking them up and actually finding out what they actually convey. So the ones that you have cited, I need to look them up and see whether they have any authenticity. But by the looks of it, I would abstain from commenting upon them unless I can go and look upon them. But as I said, that these are things which, of course, are of miraculous nature. The natural ability of the fire is to burn, and if the fire is made devoid of this ability, it has to be an interference by the Almighty. He, of course, must have done it in some way or the other that we might know or might not know of it. But the fact is that in such cases, perhaps it is better to confine ourselves to this verdict of the Quran, unless, of course, there is some authentic narration, which, to my knowledge, there isn't.
What I mean is that all three could not be correct.
Of course, of course.
One has to be the correct one.
Yes,
so
but
I got
also,
so confused.
we have no guarantee that one of them is correct. Maybe all three are not authentic. So, at the same time, we need to realize.
You think it is?
Yes, I think that in such matters, yes, because these are matters in which they are of the nature of a breaking of physical laws. As I said, physical laws govern this universe normally, and according to these physical laws, we do understand that fire's natural ability is to burn people, but here it did not burn. So the narration of the Quran should be enough for us, of course, as I said, until we have something authentic about it. And as far as your second question is concerned regarding how can we be sure that we have seen the Prophet, the answer is that we cannot be sure. And it's all conjecture, and it's also a hunch that at best we can gather, because you see, from the contents of the dream, at times we do get this inkling that this has to be the Prophet that who has said certain words or certain such words, because it's only his status. But we need to be cautious that this is not a certain interpretation. It can never be a certain interpretation, because none of us has seen the Prophet. And that is what the Prophet has once actually told his Sahaba also that if you see me in your dream, then you will be actually seeing me, because Satan cannot take my appearance. He was actually telling this to his companions because they had seen his real face, and when his real face, what I'm saying is that only the companions of the Prophet can be certain that they have seen the Prophet in their dream, because they have seen him in real life as well. We can also see him in our dream, but we can never be certain. There'll be always a element of doubt, because we've not seen his real face. It's only by the content of what he might have said to us in our dream that we make this inference that this has to be the Prophet. But as I said, this can never be a certain inference. Right. We cannot, because as I said, that unless you have seen the Prophet's original face, you can never be certain, and none of us has seen the Prophet. All we can do is speculate. Certainly not. They should not. I would strongly advise people not to make any such claim. Okay, thank you very much. So we end our session here. I hope, inshallah, we shall meet again on next Saturday at the same time. Until then, it is goodbye and Khuda Hafiz.